Thank you. So I'm also live on Twitch, on YouTube, and I'm in the Discord channel, Thingy Bobby Live. And today we are reading Orientalism by Edward Saïd. We are continuing with chapter 1. And yeah, let's do the things. Actually, I do need to do something a little bit different here on OBS. Ooh, cat, you have interrupted here. Yep, and that is the wrong book that I have on the... See, I'm a silly goose. I'm an absolute silly goose. See, I should have done this all when I was setting up, but no, I'm a silly goose. But I am fixing it now. We are reading Orientalism by Edward Saïd. I'm always a silly goose. I'm the silliest goose. Yeah, so we are reading Orientalism by Edward Saïd. We are continuing with chapter 1. And I just want to talk about somebody very special to me. Not in terms of like personal relationship or anything like that. I want to talk about a person named Jane Goodall before we begin. I met Jane Goodall in 2014. And she had just, well, she was a professor. She had gotten an honorary doctorate from my then university, the University of the Witwatersrand. And Goodall was one of those people who inspired so many environmentalists, and especially women and femmes in the field of environmentalism for decades. And I'm writing a piece now loosely based on the interview that I had with her, but listening to her speak, she had this air about her that was empathetic and graceful. And back then, 2014, I had just turned 30. I was still a young idealist kind of journalist. And I was kind of getting jaded with how we work towards environmental justice. And she told me one thing that I think Greta Thunberg, well, you guys know her as Thunberg, but in Swedish her surname is pronounced Thunberg. One thing that Greta is teaching us now, Jane Goodall said it. Every single struggle is interconnected. The struggle against capitalism, the struggle against white supremacy, the struggle against patriarchy, the struggle for environmental justice. Everything is connected back to capital. And that is where I got that idea from, that I call the trifecta of oppression. That's where I got it from. And she said she didn't like the term the developing world, and she didn't like the term the third world. This was back in 2014. I am now 41. She said that the reason that she doesn't like those terms is because they always relate to the marginalized people in relation to the North, in relation to the West, in relation to the so-called First World. And we exist in our own right as ourselves. So how do we put this? How do we encapsulate this? By positively asserting our existence on this world. And I raised my hand in this, I can't even believe I did this. I was just like, I might have the answer. I was in a one-on-one interview with this woman. I was terrified. And by that point, I had already interviewed Sir David Attenborough. I had already interviewed some of the greatest minds of our time. And she said, yeah, what's your idea? And I said, I have read Walter Rodney. I have read, about calling the developing nations the underdeveloped nations, because that was the purpose of colonization in the first place, is to extract riches. But how about the global majority? And she said, that's it. Because the proletariat, and the black, brown, and indigenous proletariat at that, are the global majority. And give me a couple of seconds. My husband is an ardent environmentalist. He's an environmental engineer. When he left his first place of work after graduating with his master's in environmental engineering, he was given this. It's this beautiful little Lego set saying, Jane Goodall, ethologist. She wasn't just an environmentalist. And I know she was old. She lived a good life, good innings. Look at this little bugger. But somehow, her death today of all days, when the Samud flotilla is being boarded by Israeli terrorists, when the US government shutdown is happening, when I got the news this morning of more of our comrades in Gaza being targeted by the IOF, that talk with her back in February 2014 on my husband's birthday, it seems like maybe we were too hopeful. But maybe we're not hopeful enough. So rest in peace, Jane Goodall. I'm always going to be grateful for her teaching me about how everything in this world is interconnected. Yeah. As a young journalist, I needed that. I needed that lesson in what role each of us can play in the bigger picture, in how we can all make a difference regardless of what we're doing, as long as it is for the betterment of humanity, for the environment, and for all living things. Even saving one chimpanzee is a success. And so now we get back to Edward Saïd, also a brilliant mind. Cultural strength is not something we can discuss easily. And one of the purposes of the present work is to illustrate, analyze, and reflect upon Orientalism as an exercise of cultural strength. In other words, it's better not to risk generalizations about so vague and yet so important a notion as cultural strength until a good deal of material has been analyzed first. But at the outset, one can say that so far as the West was concerned during the 19th and 20th centuries, an assumption had been made that the Orient and everything in it was, if not patently inferior to, then in need of corrective study by the West. And there was always the sense of there is a dire need of correction whenever it came to these paternalistic views of what was considered not the West, or not the First World, or, as I said to Jane Goodall that day, the global majority. The Orient was viewed as if framed by the classroom, the criminal court, the prison, the illustrated manual. Orientalism, then, is knowledge of the Orient that places things Oriental in a class, court, prison, or manual for scrutiny, study, judgment, discipline, or governing. It's the cat. Thank you, cat. During the early years of the 20th century, men like Balfour and Cromer could say what they said in the way they did, because an earlier tradition of Orientalism than the 19th century one provided them with a vocabulary, imagery, rhetoric, and figures with which to say it. Yet Orientalism reinforced, and was reinforced by, the certain knowledge that Europe or the West literally commanded the vastly greater part of the Earth's surface. The period of immense advance in institutions and content of Orientalism coincides exactly with the period unparalleled in European expansion, from 1815 to 1914. European direct colonial domination expanded from about 35% of the Earth's surface to about 85% of it. Every continent was affected, none more than Africa and Asia. The two greatest empires were the British and French, allies and partners in some things, in others hostile rivals. In the Orient, from the eastern shores of the Mediterranean to Indochina and Malaya, their colonial possessions and imperial spheres of influence were adjacent, frequently overlapping, often fought over. But it was in the Near Orient, the lands of the Arab Near East, where Islam was supposed to define cultural and racial characteristics, that the British and French encountered each other and the Orient with the greatest intensity, familiarity, and complexity. Now, if we look at the arguments that are presented against the existence of Palestine as a state before 1948. We have people asking the questions, who was their president? Tell me, what was their court system like? Tell me about their university rankings. Every single thing that is asked about in these quote-unquote debates, thank you, love, is rooted in colonial thought, colonial patterns, and colonial violence. They would assume that a country is only legitimate if it had a Western version of governance. Any country was only deemed in any way, shape, or form legitimate if it had been colonized and corrected. For much of the 19th century, as Lord Salisbury put it in 1881, the common view of the Orient was intricately problematic. When you've got a faithful ally who is bent on meddling in a country in which you are deeply interested, you have three courses open to you. You may renounce, monopolize, or share. Renouncing would have been to place the French across our road to India. Monopolizing would have been a very near risk of war, so we resolved to share. Wasn't there land to share between themselves? And share they did in ways that we shall investigate presently. What they shared, however, was not only land or profit or rule, it was a kind of intellectual power, the intellectual power I have been calling Orientalism, a library or archive of information commonly and in some aspects unanimously held. Binding the archive together was a family of ideas and unifying set of values, proven in various ways to be effective. These ideas explained the behavior of Orientals, supplied Orientals with the mentality, genealogy, atmosphere, and most important, allowed Europeans to deal and even see Orientals as a phenomenon possessing regular characteristics, rather than a group of people, But like any set of durable ideas, Orientalist notions influenced people who were called Orientals, as well as those called Occidental, European, or Western. In short, Orientalism is better grasped as a set of constraints upon the limitations of thought than it is simply a positive doctrine. It's not ideas that are rooted in the truth. This is... You know how we always say that there's no such thing as objectivity? Because everything is viewed, everything is passed through a certain lens. I will never be able to see the West as anything but a colonizing force, because I am always viewing it through a colonized lens. Same. But to impose my worldview onto somebody else and say mine is the only correct view, I understand when a white person says, oh, violence is never the answer. I understand. I don't agree with, but I understand why they're saying it. Because I know that violent resistance is never the answer to somebody who's never had to fight for their lives. These ideas that the West imposed onto the Orient, to Africa, to South America, to the indigenous people of Turtle Island, to the Aboriginal people of Australia, the Maori of Aotearoa. These ideas were imposed upon people, that this is the only correct way to live. In the essence of Orientalism is the ineradicable distinction between Western superiority and Oriental inferiority. So then we must be prepared to note how, in its development and subsequent history, Orientalism deepened and even hardened the distinction. When it became commonplace, or a commonplace practice during the 19th century, for Britain to retire administrators from India and elsewhere once they reached the age of 55, then a further refinement once they each reached the age of... oh, for fuck's sake. Let me start this again. Orientalism deepened and even hardened the distinction. When it became common practice during the 19th century for Britain to retire its administrators from India and elsewhere once they had reached the age of 55, then a further refinement in Orientalism had been achieved. No Oriental was ever allowed to see a Westerner as he aged and degenerated, just as no Westerner needed ever to see himself mirrored in the eyes of the subject race as anything but vigorous, rational, the ever-alert young Raj. Ouch. Orientalist ideas took a number of different forms during the 19th and 20th centuries. First of all, in Europe, there was a vast literature about the Orient inherited from the European past. What is distinctive about the late 18th and early 19th centuries, which is where the study assumes modern Orientalism to have begun, is that an Oriental Renaissance took place, as Edgar Quinet phrased it. Suddenly, it seemed to a wide variety of thinkers, politicians, and artists that a new awareness of the Orient, which was extended from China to the Mediterranean, had arisen. I did not let people know in the server that I was live. No, I don't want to tag Everett, even though I absolutely adore the man. Orientalist ideas took a number of different forms, blah, 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 during the 19th and 20th centuries. First of all, in Europe, there was a vast literature about the Orient inherited from the European past. What is distinctive about the late 18th and early 19th centuries, which is where the study assumes modern Orientalism to have begun, is that an Oriental Renaissance took place, as Edgar Quinet phrased it. Suddenly, it seemed to a wide variety of thinkers, politicians, and artists that a new awareness of the Orient, which extended from China to the Mediterranean, had arisen. This awareness was partly the result of a newly discovered and translated Oriental texts in languages like Sanskrit, Zend, and Arabic. It is also the result of newly perceived relationships between the Orient and the West. For purposes here, the keynote of this relationship was set for the Near East and Europe by the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt in 1798, an invasion which in many ways was the model of a truly scientific appropriation of one culture by another, apparently stronger one. For with Napoleon's occupation of Egypt was set in motion between East and West still dominate our contemporary cultural and political perspectives. This is Orientalism by Edward Saïd. Please continue tippity-tapping the screen and sharing the live. I'll get to that in a little bit. If he talks about it. I don't know if he does talk about it, but thank you. We have a sense of we can locate the beginning of the nation of Israel from here. The reason why. 1798 is when Napoleon took Egypt. He said he conquered it. No. He browbeat everybody. Thank you so much we find that in a sense, there are so many levels of untruths that come out of this period. The Battle of Acre was won by Napoleon, and the history books just don't like him because he's short. He wasn't all that short anyway. That Napoleon just wasn't liked by the Middle Easterners, so they made up this history. What actually happened? He lost the Battle of Acre, and in his anger said, Jerusalem is here. The Holy Land is here. The people of Palestine do not appreciate what the West was trying to give them, so let's take their land and give it to the Jewish people of Europe to solve the Jewish problem. That is what he said. The idea of colonizing Palestine goes all the way back to 1799. And the idea of Zionism, political Zionism, even further back. The Napoleonic expedition, with a great collective monument of erudition, the Description de l'Égypte, provided a scene or setting for Orientalism, since Egypt and subsequently other Islamic lands were viewed as the live province, the laboratory, the theatre of effective Western knowledge about the Orient, and I shall return to the Napoleonic adventure a little later. With such experiences as Napoleon, the Orient as a body of knowledge in the West was modernized, and this is the second form in which the 19th and 20th century Orientalism existed. From the outset of this period, we examine that there was everywhere amongst the Orientalists the ambition to formulate their discoveries, experiences, and insights suitably in modern terms, to put ideas about the Orient in very close touch with modern realities, like Renan's linguistic investigations of the Semitic languages in 1848, for example, contemporary comparative grammar, comparative anatomy, and racial theory. 1848, long before Carl Linnaeus. These lent his Orientalism prestige, and the other side of the coin made Orientalism valuable or vulnerable, as it has ever been since, to modish as well as seriously influenced currents of thought in the West. So what he's saying here is, whenever the West tried to justify domination, it made their theories quite vulnerable. Not because it was pseudoscience, which it was, but they had to, especially with Orientalism, they had to cover up their tracks and destroy all the knowledge that was already gathered from there and delegitimize it, so that their pseudoscience would never be disproven by the actual science of the Middle East. Thank you. Oh my goodness, that's the first one. Thank you. That's my first one. And I don't like swans as actual animals, but I did play the black swan in a university production of Swan Lake. And yes, I did ballet for a long time. Orientalism has been subjected to imperialism, positivism, utopianism, historicism, Darwinism, racism, Freudianism, Marxism, Spenglerism, but Orientalism, like many of the natural and social sciences, has had paradigms of research in its own learned societies, its own establishment, capital E. During the 19th century, the field increased enormously in prestige, as did the reputation and influences of institutions as the Société Asiatique, the Royal Asiatic Society, the Gesellschaft that we spoke about earlier, the American Oriental Society. But also there's a university in London, still in existence today, called SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, as part of the University of London. With the growth of these societies went also an increase all across Europe in the number of professorships in Oriental studies, consequently an expansion in the available means for disseminating Orientalism as a study. Periodicals, beginning with the Fundgaben des Orients in 1809, multiplied the quantity of knowledge as well as the number of specialities, only to be studied by Westerners, by the way. Yet, little of this activity and very few of these institutions existed and flourished freely, for in a third form which existed, Orientalism imposed limits upon thought about it. Even the most imaginative writers of the age, like Flaubert, Nerval, or Scott, were constrained in what they could either experience or say about it. For Orientalism was ultimately a political vision of reality, whose structure promoted the difference between familiar, Europe, West, us, and the strange, the Orient, East, them. The vision, in a sense, created and served the two worlds, and this was thus conceived. Orientals lived in their world, we lived in ours. The vision and material reality propped each other up and kept each other going. A certain freedom of intercourse was always the Westerner's privilege, because his was stronger in culture, the Westerner's privilege. He could penetrate, he could wrestle with it, he could give shape and meaning to the great Asiatic mystery, as Disraeli once called it. Yet, what has, I think, been previously overlooked is the constricted vocabulary of such privilege, and the comparative limitations of such vision. My argument is that the Orientalist reality is both anti-human and persistent. And I agree. Its scope, as much as its institutions had all-pervasive influence, last up to the present. But how does Orientalism work? Now, when we look at everything that he said, Orientalism operates as an idea to control the narrative, which they are still trying to do now, and they are failing. How can one describe it altogether as a historical phenomenon, a way of thought, a contemporary problem, and a material reality? Because it did become a material reality. It absolutely is a material reality. It's a reality that is rooted in white supremacist ideas of how not just the world works, but in how Western society works, in how we perceive our own existence through a Western lens. It was, and I always go back to, what's his name? Frantz Fanon, when he said that we cannot extricate ourselves from whiteness. We really cannot extricate ourselves from whiteness. And why is that? Because every single one of our identities has been created and maintained through whiteness defining us. We were never defined as races before whiteness came along, before white supremacy came and told us that we are inferior. Consider Cromer again, an accomplished technician of empire, but also a beneficiary of Orientalism, furnishing us with the rudimentary answer. In The Government of Subject Races, he writes and wrestles with the problem of how Britain, a nation of individuals, is to administer a wide-flung empire according to a number of central principles. He contrasts the local agent, who is both a specialist in knowledge of the native and the Anglo-Saxon individuality, with a central authority and a home in London. The former may treat subjects of local interest in a manner calculated to damage or even jeopardize imperial interests. The central authority is in a position to obviate any danger arising from this course. Why? Because this authority can ensure the harmonious working of the different parts of the machine and should endeavor, so far as possible, to realize the circumstances attendant on the government of the dependency. They still call it dependencies today. Africa is still referred to in official papers as the extraction entity. The language is vague and unattractive, on purpose. But the point is not hard to grasp. Cromer envisions a seat of power in the West radiating outward toward the East in a great embracing machine, sustaining the central authority yet commanded by it. When the machine branches feed into it from the East, human material is converted into more power. The specialist does the immediate translation, the mere Oriental matter, into useful substances. The Oriental becomes, for example, a race, an example of the Oriental mentality, all for the enhancement of the authority at the time. Therefore, we can see all the way back when, well before colonialism or colonization was ever a formal term, that all of this dependency on Western countries was instilled through individualism of the Westerner and the homogenization of the Oriental. Local interests are Orientalist special interests. The central authority is the general interest of the imperial society as a whole. What Cromer quite accurately sees is the management of knowledge by society. The fact that knowledge, no matter how special, is regulated first by the local concerns of a specialist, later by the general concerns of the social system of authority. The interplay between the local and central interests is intricate, but by no means indiscriminate. And that's important, because they choose. They choose what they want the rest of the world to know. It's like all the information that was filtered out from apartheid South Africa to the rest of the world when people thought, no, this is fine. There is no war in Ba Sing Se. In Cromer's own case, as an imperial administrator, the proper study is also man, he says. When Pope proclaimed the proper study of mankind to be man, he meant all men, including the poor Indian, whereas Cromer also reminds us that certain men, such as Orientals, can be singled out as the subject for quote-unquote proper study. The proper study in the sense as Orientals is Orientalism, separate from other forms of knowledge, because they wanted to separate all forms of knowledge to divide and conquer. Separating knowledge led to separating people. The material and social reality closing all knowledge at any time, supporting knowledge, provided it with uses. An order of sovereignty was set up from east to west, a mock chain of being who was cleverest. Hi. And look at this, once given by Kipling. Mule, horse, elephant, or bullock. He obeys his driver, and the driver his sergeant, and the sergeant his lieutenant, and the lieutenant his captain, and the captain his major, and the major his colonel, and the colonel his brigadier, commanding 3 regiments, and the brigadier his general, who obeys the viceroy, who is the servant of the empress. Oh, I'm sorry. As deeply forged as this monstrous chain of command, as strongly managed as is Chroma's harmonious working, Orientalism can also express the strength of the West and the Orient's weakness, as seen by the West. Such strength and weaknesses are as intrinsic to Orientalism as they are to any view that divides the world into large general divisions, entities that coexist in a state of tension, produced by what is believed to be radical difference. For that is the main intellectual issue raised here. Can one divided human reality, as indeed human reality seems to be genuinely divided, into clearly different cultures, histories, traditions, societies, and races, how can it survive the consequences humanely or humanly? What? Where? If they are left tenants, what about the right tenants? The right tenants are now all landlords. Sorry. My apologies. By surviving the consequences humanly, I mean to ask whether there's a way of avoiding the hostility expressed by division, say of men into us and they. For such divisions are generalities whose use historically and actually no, this sentence structure is terrible. For whose use, historically and actually, has been to press the importance of the distinction between some men and some other men, usually towards not especially admirable ends. When one uses categories like Oriental and Western as both a starting and endpoint of analysis, research, public policy, and categories that were used by Balfour and Chroma, the result is usually to polarize. Oh, this is my new tattoo. Well, not so new. There. It's the outline of Africa with the Mendi designs inside it. The Oriental becomes more Oriental, the Westerner more Western, and limit the human encounter between these different cultures, traditions, and societies. In short, from its earliest modern history to the present, Orientalism as a form of thought dealing with the foreign has typically shown an altogether regrettable tendency of any knowledge based on such hard and fast distinction, such as East and West. Oh, I'm sorry. Do you have a Vicks vapor rub? If you have Vicks vapor rub, boil your kettle. While it's still boiling hot, pour it into a bowl and melt some Vicks vapor rub inside the boiling water, and then put a towel over your head and over the bowl, and just breathe in the vapor from the vapor rub and the boiling water. But close your eyes when you do it. You and your fake Australian. Channeling thought into West or East as a compartment, this tendency is at the center of Orientalist theory, practice, and values found in the West. The sense of Western power over the Orient is taken for granted as having the status of scientific truth. Self-pepper spray. Okay, I'm going to go a little bit over time today because we're almost done with the first part of chapter 1. A contemporary illustration or two should clarify this observation perfectly. It is natural for men in power to survey from time to time the world in which they must deal. Balfour did it frequently. Our contemporary, Henry Kissinger, rest in peace, does so rarely with more express frankness than his essay Domestic Structure and Foreign Policy. The drama he depicts is a real one, in which the United States must manage its behavior in the world rather than the pressures of domestic forces on the one hand and foreign allies on the other. Kissinger's discourse must, for that reason alone, establish a polarity between the US and the world. It's American exceptionalism. Such a silly. He speaks consciously as an authoritative voice for the major Western power, whose recent history and present reality have placed it before a world that does not easily accept it. Kissinger feels that the United States can deal less problematically with the industrial developed West than it can with the developing world. Again, the contemporary reality of relations between the US and the so-called Third World, including China, Indochina, the Near East, Africa, and Latin America, is manifestly a thorny set of problems that even Kissinger could not hide. Kissinger's method in his essay proceeds according to what linguists call the binary opposition. That is, he shows that there are two styles in foreign policy, the prophetic and the political, two types of techniques, two periods, and so forth. When at the end of the historical part of his argument he is brought face to face with the contemporary world, he divides it accordingly into this binary: the developed and developing. The first half, which is the West, is deeply committed to the notion that the real world is eternal to the observer, that knowledge consists of recording and classifying data, and the more accurately, the better. Kissinger's proof for this is the Newtonian revolution, which has not yet taken place in the developing world. Is there no gravity? Oh, what did they say? Please tell me what they said. You can tell it. You can tell me on. You can tell me on Discord. Cultures which have escaped the early impact of Newtonian thinking have retained the essentially pre-Newtonian view, that the real world is almost completely internal to the observer. Consequently, imperial reality has much different significance for many of the new countries than for the West, because in a certain sense they never went through the process of discovering it. What a fucking shitwad beast of a human. Thank you, Cole. Unlike Cromer, Kissinger does not need to quote Sir Alfred Lyle on the Orientals' inability to be accurate, a point he makes sufficiently unarguable to require no validation. We had our Newtonian revolution. They didn't. That's what he says. As thinkers, we are better off than they are. Good. The lines are drawn in the same way, finally, as Balfour and Cromer drew them. Yet 60 or more years have intervened between Kissinger and the British imperialists. Wars and revolutions have proved conclusively that with the pre-Newtonian prophetic style, which Kissinger associates as inaccurate, developing countries and Europe before the Congress of Vienna is not entirely without its success. Again, unlike Balfour and Cromer, Kissinger therefore feels obligated to respect his pre-Newtonian perspective because it offers great flexibility with respect to the contemporary revolutionary turmoil. White men. Why are white men? In other words, we must still find a way by which the developing world can be contained. This is not similar to Cromer's vision of harmoniously working machines designed ultimately to benefit some central authority, opposing the developing world. Kissinger may not have known on what fund of pedigreed knowledge he was drawing from when he cut the world up into pre-Newtonian and post-Newtonian concepts of reality, but his distinction is identical with the orthodox ones made by Orientalists, who separate Orientals from the West. And like Orientalism's distinction, Kissinger is not value-free, despite the apparent neutrality of his tone, in such words as prophetic, accuracy, internal, empirical reality, and order, scattered throughout his description, characterizing attractive, familiar, desirable virtues, or menacing, peculiar, disorderly defects. Both the traditional Orientalists, as we shall see, and Kissinger conceive of the difference between cultures first, as creating a battlefront that separates them, and second, as inviting the West to control, contain, and otherwise govern, through either superior knowledge and accommodating power, or just plain dominance over the other. With that effect, and what considerable expense such militant divisions have been maintained, no one at present needs to be reminded. Other illustration dovetails neatly, perhaps too neatly, with Kissinger's analysis. In February 1972, the American Journal of Psychiatry printed an essay by Harold W. Gilden, who identified as a retired member of the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, the United States Department of State. I hate the Department of State. The essay's title, The Arab World. Its tone and content argue a highly characteristic Orientalist bent of mind. Thus, his 4-page, double-columned psychological portrait of over 100 million people considered for a period of 1,300 years, Gledden cites exactly 4 sources for his views: a recent book on Tripoli, a travel book, one issue of the Egyptian newspaper Al-Ahram, the periodically Orient Moderno, and a book by Majid Khadouri, a well-known Orientalist in the West. The article itself purports to uncover the inner workings of Arab behavior, which from our point of view is aberrant, but for Arabs is normal. After this auspicious start, we are told that Arabs stress conformity, inhabit shame in a culture whose prestige system involves the ability to attract followers and clients. As an aside, we are told that Arab society has always been based on a system of client-patron relationships instead of ones of friendship. Arabs can only function in conflict situations. This prestige is based on the ability to dominate others, and a shame culture, Islam itself, makes a virtue of revenge or jihad. Glidden triumphantly cites June 29, 1970, Ahram, to show that in 1969 in Egypt, in 1,070 cases of murder, the perpetrators were apprehended. 20% were based on the desire to wipe out shame, on the desire to justify real or imaginary wrongs, and 31% on the desire for blood revenge. From a Western point of view, the only rational thing for the Arabs to do is make peace. For the Arabs, the situation is not governed by logic, for objectivity is not a value in the Arab system. I want to slap them. I want to go to the past. I want to hijack a TARDIS and go to the past and take a dirty fly swat and just slap each and every one of these people. Glidden continues enthusiastically. It's a notable fact, he says fact, that while the Arab value system demands solidarity within the group, it encourages among its members a rivalry that is destructive for that very solidarity. In Arab society, only success counts and justifies the means. Living naturally in the world is characterized by anxiety, expressed in generalized suspicion and distrust, which has been labeled free-floating hostility. You notice how the language that they use about Arab people here is almost exactly the same as the language that was used against the Jewish people in Europe. Just a thought. The art of subterfuge is highly developed in Arab life and in Islam itself. The Arab need for vengeance overrides everything, otherwise the Arab would feel ego-destroying shame. Therefore, if Westerners consider peace to be in the high scale of values, we have a highly developed consciousness of the value of time, and this is not true of Arabs. In fact, we're told in Arab tribal society, where Arab values originated, strife, not peace, was the normal state of affairs because raiding was one of the two main supports of the economy. The purpose of this learned disquisition was merely to show how the Western and Oriental scale of values, the relative position of the elements, is quite different. This is the apogee of the Orientalist confidence. No merely asserted generality is denied the dignity of truth. No theoretical list of Oriental attributes is without application of the behavior of Orientals in the real world, in comparison to the West, of course. Without natural suspicion, the latter are none of these things. Out of what collective and peculiarized view does the Orient do these statements emerge? What specialized skills, imaginative pressures, institutions, and traditions, what cultural force produce such similarity of the descriptions of the Orient to be found in Cromer, Balfour, and our contemporary statesmen? I would say it is the desire to call it the opposite. Of what it actually is. Any questions? I'm going to scold you, Cole, because you sent me a lot of gifts today, and I adore you, and I'm very, very appreciative. But please, I know that things are tough, and the new job is not exactly steady yet, so please take care of yourself first, okay? That being said, I do these readings for free. So please, if you can, support what I do by going to my Linktree and clicking on the links, supporting the Patreon, all of those wonderful things. All right. And I shall see you all next week Tuesday, because tomorrow night I am taking a break before I start with Pumla's book next week, Thursday. Alrighty. Remember, drink water, eat something, take your meds, smash the motherfucking patriarchy, eat all the white men, and if you don't eat meat, compost them. And remember to be kind to yourselves, because every single person, all of you, deserve kindness, especially yourself. Thank you for